So this is the contents of today's session. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of generally how 2020 looked in the out-of-home market. And then I'm going to focus on three of the key messages that we were given last year. So work from home if you can, practice social distancing and stay home, save lives, and how those messages impacted our day-to-day lives. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think is going to happen this year. I think it's useful before I begin to explain what I mean when I talk about out of home, because obviously it's quite a big sector in many ways. So our panel captures purchases anywhere you can buy food and non-alcoholic drink out of home or order it into the home for delivery and immediate consumption. Our data is demographically representative of the GB population. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is predominantly GB, but I am pulling out some specific statistics looking at what the impact has been in Wales. And I've just got along the bottom there the different channels that we cover and I'll be talking about today. So first off, 2020. So as Alison already said, we had a shocker year in the out-of-home market. So the government restrictions that were put in place impacted every area of our lives. And the net result of this was a significant decline in our spend on food and drink away from the home. So at total GB level, the market dropped by almost a third. In terms of the number of people interacting with the market, because of the various points at which some things were more available, the penetration or the percentage of people actually interacting with the market didn't decline that significantly. But the big driver of decline overall was the number of trips that we were making per week. So that dropped by a third. And obviously it's understandable when, as I say, we were asked to stay home to save lives, that we weren't out and about and therefore not as available in the market. The one thing that did increase overall was actually the spend per trip, and I'll come on to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. When we hone in on what was happening in Wales, it was a very similar result. If anything, slightly worse. The decline for Wales was 38%, 37.8% compared to that third that we saw at total GB. And penetration again in Wales was slightly down compared to total GB, but again, it was this trips per week was the biggest overall decline, driver of decline in the total market. Understandably, and probably not particularly surprisingly to anybody, grocery really benefited from this. So we saw a record year in terms of the grocery market. The retail take-home grocery market had its best year ever, as people were forced to turn to that channel as they had really no other option. So when you look at the trend over time, you can see quite clearly the spike that occurred around about this time last year, when the threat of lockdowns was coming in and people were stockpiling, as the papers reported on. And you can see that massive drop there at the sort of end of March as we went into the first weeks of lockdown. And overall, the impact that this has been really significant. And I think this is something that I'm very passionate about, making sure people really understand the impact that the lockdown has had and the pandemic has had on the total food and drink market. So when we look at it, and this is excluding alcohol spend, so we're just looking here at food and drink and comparing the two, the grocery sales increased by nearly 10 billion, which, as I say, is record. It's the strongest year in grocery retail we've ever seen. But in terms of the out-of-home market, that declined by 17 billion. So the net effect of that was a loss of 17.3 billion. And obviously, we're just talking here about value of sales and not talking about profit or anything like that. But we can see the significant impact that the lockdown and the pandemic has had on the sales of food and drink in the total GB market. When we track that over time, you can see the most significant decline occurred, again, probably not surprisingly to anybody, at the 4 weeks ending 19th of April 2020. So that was basically the first 4 weeks of lockdown, and the market dropped to 70% compared to the same period last year. And actually, and I looked at this for Wales, it was an even greater decline. So it was 75% at that point. And as things started to open up, and we've mapped a few of the key things that occurred throughout the year, and you can see that that decline started to soften. So as we went through the first few weeks of the pandemic, initially, obviously, all takeaway and all delivery most of it was closed, but there was a gradual reopening, and that saw a slight return to the market. And then as we hit the summer months, obviously we had staged and phased reopenings of cafes, bars and restaurants that happened at different points in England, Scotland and Wales. And obviously this had an impact because different things happened at different points, but we can see quite clearly there that as we got into the summer months, things started to come back a little bit. And then as we had Eat Out to help out, obviously that did have a significant impact in terms of softening that decline. But again, as we hit the end of 2020 and more lockdowns were reintroduced, that decline started to accelerate again. So we had a stronger decline. As we've gone into the start of 2021, again, probably not surprisingly, we still have seen quite a significant decline ongoing, and we're not expecting that to turn around anytime soon. But the fundamental shift in our behaviours, which were brought about by these restrictions that were placed, and also the things that were physically available to consumers, has changed the shape of the market. So one of the things that we've seen that's been most significant is quick service restaurants, and that's the fast food market, the McDonald's and your KFC, so on. They've actually had a really strong year in terms of their share of the market. So they've gone from making up about a fifth of the market to making up about a third of the spend in the market in 2020. And then as you go through the different channels, you can see the impact. Pubs, bars and restaurants obviously have had the most significant impact, having been the ones that have been forced to remain closed, or at least limit their hours or their offerings for the largest part of the year. So in terms of their share of the market, they've seen the most decline. When we look at QSR though, it's not just the fact that they grew in terms of total share, they actually saw growth overall, so value growth. So they grew their value 11% year on year. I think a lot of this is because of the fact that a lot of them were already positioned to be able to respond to the delivery needs, which enabled them to remain operational. As other things were forced to close, the fact that they were already on delivery channels meant that they were able to retain a lot of their custom. And we can see how big that impact has been for them. So in 2019, around about 20% of spend in fast food restaurants came through delivery, but in 2020, that grew to 41%. So there's definitely been a significant shift, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on in terms of the way that people have interacted with the market. And again, if we look at the spend year on year and the decline, you can see at the other end of the spectrum, as I mentioned already, you've got your full service restaurants, pubs and bars, which obviously suffered the most in 2020. So going into some of the slightly more specific areas that I mentioned at the start, so one of the things that we were told back at this time last year, and in fact, I think St. Patrick's Day was the day that we were told at Kantar to work from home. So work from home if you can, which was the prevailing message of 2020, with a very small moment in September where they tried to get us back into the office, but obviously that didn't last very long as the pandemic resurged. So work from home if you can, what impact has that had? Well, obviously, it's probably not surprising to know that it's had a massive impact in terms of where we've been. So just this data is just taken from Google, and it shows where people have spent time and the percentage of time spent at different locations, a 7-day rolling average. So you can see that increase there and at home. And then on the bottom, you can see the decline in terms of transit, so travel and going to train stations and so on, and being in the workplace. Now, it did start to gradually pick up a little bit as we went through the year. Obviously, when we first went into lockdown, basically everybody was working from home. There was a lot of industries were forced to close entirely. As we moved through the pandemic, that started to change a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in terms of how that looks. But you can see still the significant change in terms of where we physically are, and I think we can probably all attest to that, the not being out and about and not being going into the office. So when we look at the actual number of consumers that say that they're now working from home compared to pre-lockdown, you can see I've got here the total GP numbers and also the numbers for Wales just as a comparison. So in total GB, there was almost double the number of people who were not working from home, that were working from home prior to lockdown. So we moved from 14% of the population to 32%. In Wales, it wasn't as significant a shift. It was 17 to 23%, but obviously still a greater number of people who were being forced to work from home where previously they had been commuting. But again, I think it's interesting note, and I think this is something that we are all, maybe when we think about the working week, those of us who do work from an office, we feel that everyone's doing the same as us, but actually there's still a significant number of people who are still going out to work for various reasons, whether working in retail, construction or travel or other industries where it just isn't possible to work from home. But it's undoubtedly true that working from home, that shift to work from home has had a massive impact on a particular sector of society. So the work from home consumer is more likely to be in their middle age, to have higher affluence and to live in a city. So we're looking here at people that are more likely to have a higher level of income. They're probably not going to have children. They're sort of in the middle-aged bracket, 35 to 55, and more likely to be London-based. And again, I think that's probably something that doesn't come as a massive surprise when we think about the types of people who are now able to work from home. But despite that rise in work from home, there is still a substantial number of trips to be won from current lockdown commuters. So there are still people who are travelling to work. So around 50% of all occasions, so that's any occasion that's had away from the home from Monday to Friday, are coming from people who are still commuting to work. So in terms of the number of occasions these people account for, so there were 333 million occasions in the working week that were from those commuters who are still travelling to work 5 days a week. And there was 1.1 billion spent by those consumers in those 5 day periods. So there is still a significant amount of movement in the market. And again, obviously, when we think specifically about full service restaurants, pubs, bars and restaurants and so on, obviously there's been a massive impact there. But if we think about the broader out of home market, there are still pockets of growth and opportunity. So in terms of who is still commuting 5 days a week, so though they're more likely to be younger, obviously not be working in office-based jobs, and more likely to have children. So we're looking at a slightly different makeup of the demographic. And again, this is total GB, so they're slightly over indexed in the North and Midlands. So it's a slightly lower socioeconomic demographic in terms of affluence, but more likely to have a family and more likely to be a little bit younger. So there are these people who are still out and about in the market. And when we see what they do, it's very much practicality-led channels that are doing well at attracting these workers. And the more indulgent ones are less popular, so they're less likely to go to a coffee shop. And again, if you might think of it as something that you might have done when you were commuting, if you were traveling to an office, or those of us who were still traveling to office, getting a coffee on the way in, those kind of occasions have dropped away. But what we have seen is people still going into high street shops, still going into the Symbols and Independents, and still where they're able to eating in their workplace canteens or in the school canteens where those were obviously available, with the caveat obviously for a lot of the year they were closed. And what we've also seen as well is that these consumers, the ones that are still working 5 days a week, again, as we said previously, they're more likely to be of a lower affluence, and they're more price conscious than other workers, and also even more price conscious than they were before the pandemic. So I think this one is a very important point around, as we move out, we hopefully move out of the pandemic and out of lockdown, is what's actually consumers are going to feel in terms of how much money they have available. So what we saw was that the spend that they were making per trip declined. So it went down to £3.43 on average, which is a decline of around 3% compared to what it was before the pandemic. And actually what was interesting is that those people who are not commuting, working from home, were actually spending a bit more. And I think there's a lot here in terms of the ability of some people who haven't been commuting to work, who maybe have been saving money, that when they have been spending that bit more. So one of the other, I guess, key things that we saw in 2020 was this new concept of social distancing. And when we think about socializing and what that means for the out-of-home market, I think, again, for a lot of what we're looking at, social occasions are one of the key factors in when we decide to eat out of the home. So almost a quarter of what we spent on main meals in 2019 was for a social occasion, which made it the most important reason for buying meals out of the home. And in 2019, there was over 500 million occasions that were social occasions that were made in the out-of-home market. And those social occasions are, again, probably not particularly surprisingly, very reliant on the dining out market in the normal year. So 80% of those occasions out of home were on-premise occasions. So we were actually sitting in a restaurant having a social occasion with friends. And all those occasions, they tended to be larger group occasions. So 15% of them had 4 or more people present. So these social occasions that were very much about meeting friends, being out and about, were very much led into the sitting in, dining in moment. But when we were forced to drop those occasions, by necessity, we did seek out social occasions through other means. So those social occasions are still really important. I think one of the things that we're looking at as we come into 2021 is there is, I think, for a lot of people, although there is still nervousness around, there is a desire to meet friends and meet family. And one of the things that we saw as we went through 2020 was actually the desire to maintain those social occasions, but using food on the go or takeaway as a way and means of doing that. So whilst you weren't necessarily able to or willing to go into a restaurant per se, you were still looking to have those occasions. So you can see that as we went through the year, the on-the-go occasions that were social started to really resurge. And therefore, I think food on the go became less about functionality. So we often think about food on the go as something that is as a practical thing. You're on your way to the office, you grab a coffee, or you're out doing your weekly shopping and you pop in somewhere to get a sandwich or a drink to keep you going as you're going around the high street. But as those occasions slightly dropped away, what we saw was actually those on the go occasions were much more likely to be treat driven. And about having sweet snacks and things that made us feel good. And that was even more the case when they were group or social occasions. So you can see here that the practicality element dropped away. And actually what we were looking for is when we were able to get out in the market and when we were able to see our friends, we were looking for something that would treat or reward us. And again, as we look forward into 2021, I think that element, the out of home market is very much, again, a treat-led market, a rewarding market. It's about something that we do to, to make ourselves feel good. And I think those kind of occasions are going to continue to be important as we come out of the pandemic lockdowns. So the final section I'm going to talk about today is stay home, save lives, which is probably one of the most prevalent messages that we saw in 2020. And one of the things that we saw, and again, I think this is probably not a huge surprise to many of you, is that the significant drop in out-of-home consumptions actually saw an increase in takeaways delivered into the home. So the market, as I mentioned at the start, the data that we're looking at here and the whole data that I've been looking at includes deliveries brought back into the home. And that was the area that we saw a massive amount of growth in 2020. So the delivery market is worth nearly 6 billion in 2020, which was an increase of 3.5 billion, so a huge increase. And as I mentioned already, QSR accounted for a big proportion of that. In terms of the number of occasions that we were having, that massively increased as well. So a lot of people for whom maybe delivery was once a month treat, it suddenly became something that was happening much more frequently. As I'm sure I'm not alone in getting, if not sick of cooking, then certainly sick of doing the washing up after doing the cooking. And so delivery allowed people to have that variety and not have to prepare every single meal for themselves. Interestingly, the spend per trip slightly declined, and I think a lot of that is due to the kind of the nature and the makeup of the types of occasions we were having that were delivery occasions and where they were coming from. But the biggest overall driver, I think, in terms of growth was the number of people coming into the market. And I'll talk about that in a little moment, about the increase in terms of people who maybe hadn't interacted with the takeaway or delivery market before, who did embrace it in 2020. And again, we've looked at this for Wales as well, just to see what the difference is. And it's a very similar story. So it's a massive increase in terms of the value of food spent on delivery. So £281 million on delivery in 2020. Again, a similar increase in number of trips and a similar increase in terms of the number of shoppers. But the slight difference here, which is interesting, is that the spend per trip being slightly higher than what we saw at total GB level. So pointing towards maybe slightly more indulgent occasions, slightly more expensive meals. So as I mentioned already, the number of new shoppers this year in terms of delivery massively impacted the market. And what was interesting was the demographic profile of those shoppers, where we saw previously delivery tended to skew towards younger and quite often a variety of different socioeconomic demographics. What we saw in 2020 was actually an increase in terms of older shoppers coming into the market. So those 55 plus and those that were retired. Again, and going back to what we saw previously and what I mentioned about in terms of general the varying economic individual impacts. Again, probably not surprising that it was ABC1 shoppers who increased their spend the most. So there was an increase rather in those types of shoppers, potentially again those people who would normally be going out for a meal maybe once or twice a month and substituting that for a takeaway or a delivery into the home. And again, London and the South, and I think a lot of this is to some degree influenced by the nature of delivery, but the biggest growth came from London and the South. Well, one of the things that we really noticed last year, which I think is quite significant and something to think about as we go forward into 2021, is that the way that we use delivery has actually changed, and it's fulfilling more meal types and occasions. So whereas we probably all think about takeaway deliveries being an evening meal occasion, and it still is, and I'll speak to that in a moment, actually lunch has grown its share of at-home delivery occasions. So you can see here, when you compare 2020 and look back at the whole year, if you look back to January, around about 5% of occasions of delivery were for lunch, and by the time we got to the end of the year, it was 15%. So 3 times as many of those occasions were happening at lunchtime. And in terms of the reasons, drivers behind it, so fancied a change. I think as I already mentioned, that's a big driver of what we've seen in terms of deliveries, wanting something different, wanting something new, but also the convenient element of it. It was quick, it was easy to come by, it was something that you could just get hold of quite quickly and quite easily through using either one of the aggregators or just through phoning up your local restaurant. But as I mentioned already, it's testament to how important it is for the evening meal that despite losing share, there were still an additional 143 million dinner occasions in 2020. So those are occasions for the evening meal. An evening meal, despite having lost a little bit of share because of that growth of lunchtime occasions, still accounts for 70% of all delivery occasions brought back into the home. So as I say, it's down around about 7 percentage points compared to 2019, but still by far and away the biggest at-home delivery occasion is for the evening meal. And one of the things that we expect to see as we come out of the pandemic and out of lockdown is that this is a long-term behavioural shift that isn't going to go back to necessarily how it was before. And I don't think we'll see delivery to continue to grow at the numbers that we saw this year. And I think definitely as restaurants and pubs and bars are reopened, there will be a shift for some people back into the market. But a lot of people who've engaged with food service delivery for the first time are likely to keep that behaviour going. So 54% of consumers who said that they used delivery during lockdown said that they expected to continue to do so. And those consumers account for around about 80% spend on delivery. In terms of what they're buying, pizza by far and away is the biggest the biggest sole product, and again, probably not surprising, it very much is a sort of a delivery staple and accounts for around about a third of all trips. And again, in terms of the profile, so obviously I mentioned already that we saw an increase in terms of older consumers into the market, but still the number of those who are likely to continue the behaviours into the longer term are more likely to be those who are a little bit younger and who have children still at home. So just to sum up what I've spoken about today, I think the key thing that we've seen is obviously the balance of the working week has meant that there's been a shift in terms of who is available to the market to the younger and more working classes. I think it's very important that the market is aware of this and there is a price consciousness in what we're putting out there, and also something that is practical and functional that's going to appeal to those who are still available. As we go through the next few months, we still don't have any real clarity in terms of when particular things are going to happen, but certainly everyone seems to expect that working from home is going to continue, if not to the degree we see it now, at least in some way. So the commuters, those who are out in the market, are going to potentially make up a slightly different proportion than they did before. As we move into the summer months or spring, and the likelihood that the reintroduction of socialising is going to be outdoor before it becomes back into the home, it's likely that outdoor occasions are going to see an increase. So people socialising and picnics in the park, so on and so forth. And whilst people are still concerned about the economic impact of the pandemic, one of the things that we've seen from the research that we've done is that there is a concern around local businesses being able to weather the storm, and there is a impetus or desire to support those local businesses. I think that's really important because obviously with the everyone being forced to stay more local, I think a lot more people have become more aware and conscious of their local food service outlets. And finally, I think at-home delivery occasions will just continue into 2021. We don't see that behaviour going anywhere. We saw a lot of companies, a lot of retailers pivot to be able to offer delivery where maybe they didn't before. And people are becoming more experimental, looking for new occasions, having different types of food at home. And we expect this to continue into 2021. And as people, as I say, I think people will want to go back out into the market. I think there's definitely an appetite for it. At the same time, this delivery market isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.